Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I was going through what felt like the world's longest divorce. When couples split, friends feel like they have to pick sides even when nobody asks them to. My ex-husband had been the social butterfly in our relationship, so most of our friends were really his friends that I'd gotten to know over the years. I didn't expect them to choose me, but it still stung when the dinner invitation stopped coming and the group chat went silent. I'd been the one who house sat for these people when they went on vacation. I fed their cats, watered their plants, brought in their mail. We'd had game nights at our place every other weekend. I thought we were actually friends, not just people who tolerated me because I was married to their buddy. But when push came to shove, I found out where I really stood. The divorce was messy and drawn out, lawyers, mediation, the whole 9 yards. But we were finally getting close to the end when my ex invited me to this industry event. I guess it was one of those maybe we can work things out moments that sometimes happen during divorce proceedings. He'd even gotten me a VIP ticket and experience package, which wasn't cheap. I figured why not? Maybe we could at least end things on a civil note. So I showed up to this fancy event, went to the VIP room to collect my credentials and swag bag. That's when I ran into him. Let's call him the friend. The friend had been one of my ex's closest buddies. This was a guy whose 2 cats I'd taken care of for a week when he and his girlfriend went to Europe. I'd driven to his place twice a day to feed them, clean their litter boxes, and make sure they had fresh water. We'd spent countless evenings at his apartment playing board games and watching movies. When I saw him, I greeted him cheerfully and asked how he was doing. He just said, "Oh," in this flat, cold tone. Then he stared at me for about 10 seconds, like I was something disgusting he'd stepped on. After that, he literally walked around me like I was a piece of furniture blocking his path. He didn't say another word to me. The message was crystal clear. As far as he was concerned, I no longer existed. Fine, I got it. Divorce makes people uncomfortable, and he'd chosen his side. I wasn't going to beg for his friendship. I collected my VIP stuff, enjoyed the event, and moved on with my life. The divorce was finalized a few months later and I started fresh. Fast forward about 3 years. I'd remarried an amazing person, my career was going great, and I built a whole new circle of friends who actually wanted me around. I was working at a prestigious firm in a senior position, making good money, and generally living my best life. Then one Tuesday morning, I'm going through my work emails and I see one from an address I don't recognize. I open it up and nearly choke on my coffee. The email started with the friend acting like we were old pals who'd just lost touch. He told me it had been a long time since we'd connected and hoped I was doing well. He said he'd been following my career and was impressed with my success at the firm. He complimented me on making a name for myself there. I'm already rolling my eyes, but it gets worse. Then he casually mentioned that he'd just applied for a position at my company and had put me down as a referral. He said he knew I'd put in a good word for him with the hiring team and that he was looking forward to potentially working together again. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. This was the same guy who'd literally pretended I didn't exist 3 years ago. The same guy who'd made it clear that our friendship meant nothing to him the moment it became inconvenient. I immediately pulled up his profile on professional networking sites. Turns out he'd been job hunting for almost 8 months. His current position had ended 6 months ago, and from what I could see, he wasn't having much luck finding something new. My first instinct was to just ignore the email completely, pretend I never saw it, just like he'd pretended not to see me that day. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. He had some serious nerve using my name and my position to try to get his foot in the door, especially after the way he'd treated me. I decided to take action. I called our human resources department and asked to speak with the recruitment coordinator. I told them I needed to let them know that someone had applied for a position here and listed me as a referral without my permission. They asked for the applicant's name, which sounded unusual to them. I gave them his name and explained the situation. how he'd cut me out of his life during my divorce and was now trying to use my professional reputation to get a job. They asked if I would recommend him for the position. I told them absolutely not. I explained that I questioned the judgment of anyone who would use someone's name as a reference without asking first, especially someone they hadn't spoken to in years. They said they'd make a note in his file and thanked me for letting them know. But I wasn't done. I went to one of the partners in the department where he'd applied. This partner and I had a good working relationship, and I knew she'd appreciate the heads up. I told her I wanted to give her a heads up about one of her applicants. I explained that this guy had listed me as a referral without asking, and we hadn't spoken in 3 years. I told her the whole story, the divorce, the cold shoulder, the audacious email. She was shaking her head the whole time. She told me that the audacity of some people never ceases to amaze her. She said not to worry and that they'd handle this appropriately. Then she said that this was actually kind of hilarious. She pointed out that he clearly didn't know me very well if he thought I'd just go along with this. We both had a good laugh about it. She told me that his resume had already raised some red flags anyway, and this just confirmed their suspicions about his character. A few weeks later, I got a follow-up email from the friend. He said he wanted to check in about the position he'd applied for. He mentioned that he hadn't heard back yet and was wondering if I could follow up with the hiring team. The absolute audacity. I didn't respond to that one either. I found out later through some mutual professional connections that he never even made it to the interview stage. His application was rejected in the initial screening process. Apparently, when HR called to verify his references, they discovered that 2 of his other references had no idea he'd listed them either. About 6 months after that, I heard he'd finally found a job at a much smaller firm, making significantly less than what he would have made at our company. I never did respond to either of his emails. 3 years after graduating college, I landed a job as a software developer for a mid-sized tech company. The pay is decent and the work is interesting enough, but there's one major problem. My boss. He's one of those old-school managers who thinks that if you're not physically sitting at your desk, you're not really working. Even though our entire job can be done remotely, he insists on everyone being in the office every single day. I show up on time, meet my deadlines, and rarely take sick days. My coworkers respect me, and I get along with pretty much everyone except him. He's the type of guy who micromanages everything and acts like he's doing you a favor by letting you work there. The company has a pretty flexible work-from-home policy that most departments use regularly, but our boss refuses to let anyone in our team work remotely, even for a single day. Last Monday morning, I woke up feeling absolutely terrible. My head was pounding, my throat felt like sandpaper, and I had this nasty cough that wouldn't stop. I checked my temperature, and it was running at 101 degrees. I knew I was coming down with something bad, probably the flu that had been going around the office. I figured this would be the perfect time to work from home. I had all my projects lined up, nothing that required me to be physically present, and I could easily handle everything from my laptop. Plus, I definitely didn't want to spread whatever I had to my coworkers. That seemed like basic common sense. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to my boss around 8 a.m., about an hour before I was supposed to be in. I told him I was feeling pretty sick with fever and cough and asked if it would be okay to work from home so I wouldn't get anyone else sick. I explained that I could handle all my tasks remotely. I waited for his response, hoping he'd be reasonable about it. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. His message was short and harsh. He said there were no exceptions, and if I was well enough to work, I was well enough to be there. He told me to see him at 9. I stared at the message. Here I was, trying to be responsible and not spread illness around the office, and he was basically forcing me to come in sick. I thought about calling in completely sick, but I knew he'd probably write me up for that too. He's the type who thinks any sick day is just an excuse to slack off. So I dragged myself out of bed, took a hot shower hoping it would help me feel a little better, and got dressed. The whole time I was getting ready, I kept coughing and sneezing. My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, and every muscle in my body ached. This was definitely going to be a miserable day. I arrived at the office right at 9 a.m. looking and feeling like death warmed over. My nose was red and raw from blowing it constantly, my eyes were watery, and I had this persistent cough that I couldn't control. I walked straight to my boss's office, since I figured he'd want to see that I actually showed up. The moment I appeared in his doorway, his expression changed completely. His eyes went wide and he actually took a step back from his desk. He told me I looked terrible, his voice filled with shock. I agreed and reminded him that I had tried to tell him that this morning. I said I really thought I should be working from home today. He seemed flustered and just told me that since I was there now, I should try to keep it down. He was acting like this was somehow my fault, like I chose to be sick just to inconvenience him. I turned around and walked to my desk, coughing the entire way. Several of my co-workers looked up with concerned expressions. My desk mate immediately scooted her chair away from me. She said I sounded awful and asked if I should really be there. I explained that I had asked to work from home, but the boss said no exceptions. She called it insane and said I was going to get everyone sick. She was right, and I felt terrible about it. But what choice did I have? I started up my computer and tried to focus on my work, but it was nearly impossible. Every few minutes, I'd have a coughing fit that would last for 30 seconds. I was constantly blowing my nose, and my head was pounding so hard I could barely concentrate on my code. Around 11 a.m., I had a particularly bad coughing spell that lasted almost a full minute. I was trying to muffle it, but it was impossible. My boss came storming over to my desk. He angrily asked me to keep it down and said people were trying to work there. I told him I was doing my best, but I was really sick. I pointed out that I could be doing the same work from home without disturbing anyone. He just told me to try harder to control it. I was getting frustrated now. How exactly was I supposed to control being sick? I spent the rest of the morning trying to stifle my coughs, which only made them worse. By lunchtime, I noticed that two of my co-workers had started sniffling too. The germs were already spreading, exactly what I had tried to prevent. The afternoon was even worse. My fever seemed to be getting higher, and I was having trouble staying focused on anything. I kept making simple mistakes in my code that I normally would never make. Every time I coughed, I could see my boss glaring at me from across the room. Around 3 p.m., I had another major coughing fit right in the middle of a team meeting. Everyone was staring at me and I could tell they were all thinking the same thing. Why was I even there? My boss looked absolutely mortified. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. He suggested that maybe I should consider going home early today. I reminded him that I had asked to work from home that morning and he had said no exceptions. He claimed he didn't realize I was this sick. I pointed out that I had told him I had a fever and cough and asked what he thought that meant. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there looking uncomfortable while I packed up my things. When I was getting ready to leave, he finally spoke up again. He said that maybe I should just work from home tomorrow until I was feeling better. I told him it was funny how that worked. I left the office feeling vindicated but still terrible. The next day I worked from home and got twice as much done as I had the previous day in the office. I wasn't distracted by coughing fits or feeling miserable, and I could focus properly on my tasks. But the payoff came later that week. By Thursday, half the office was out sick with the same bug I had, my boss included. He spent the entire day working from home, claiming he was too sick to come in, but still needed to handle important meetings. The irony was not lost on anyone. When he came back the following Monday, looking sheepish and still a bit under the weather, he made an announcement to the whole team. He said he had been reconsidering our work from home policy, and moving forward, if anyone was feeling unwell, they should definitely work remotely to avoid spreading illness to the team. I told him that sounded like a great policy change. He agreed, saying that sometimes it takes a practical example to see the value in these things. Now, whenever anyone on our team feels even slightly sick, they work from home without question. I lost my left arm in a motorcycle accident 3 years ago. The drunk driver who hit me got away with a slap on the wrist, but I got a lifetime of physical therapy and a prosthetic that cost more than most people's cars. The insurance company fought me tooth and nail, but eventually I got a decent prosthetic that looks pretty real from a distance. Most people don't notice unless they're really looking. Some days are harder than others with it. What really gets to me isn't the missing limb, is how some people think they can treat me differently because of it. Like I'm fragile or something. That's exactly what happened last Tuesday at the Department of Motor Vehicles. I was there to renew my license, which required a vision test because of my disability status. The line was long as usual, probably 30 people deep. I've been waiting for about 40 minutes when this elderly woman shuffled in behind me. She had to be in her 70s, maybe 80, using a walker and moving real slow. Sweet old lady. Reminded me of my grandmother. We were making small talk about the weather when this woman in her 40s just walked right up and cut in front of the elderly lady. Just walked right past both of us, like we weren't even there. She was wearing yoga pants and had that haircut. You know the one? The "I want to speak to your manager" special. The elderly woman cleared her throat and politely told the line cutter that she might have missed where the line started, pointing toward the back. The line cutter turned around with this look on her face like someone had just told her the earth was flat. Karen snapped back that she was in a hurry and had somewhere important to be. The elderly woman explained that everyone was waiting patiently and that she'd been standing there for quite some time. Karen got more aggressive, saying she didn't have time for this because she had 3 kids to pick up from soccer practice and was already running late. The elderly woman looked confused and hurt. She started to back down, which made my blood boil. I've seen this happen too many times. People thinking they can intimidate others just because they're louder or more aggressive. I spoke up and told Karen that the elderly woman was right and that the line started at the back where everyone else had been waiting. Karen spun around to face me, her eyes narrowing when she noticed my prosthetic arm. She called me a cripple and told me to mind my own business. The whole line went quiet. I felt my face get hot, but I kept my voice steady. I told her I was minding my business, which was waiting in line like everyone else, and that her business should be going to the back of the line. Karen threatened to break my fake arm if I didn't watch my mouth. I told her she needed to calm down and get in line, and she got even more worked up, yelling that I shouldn't tell her what to do because she paid taxes in the city and had every right to be there. I pointed out that everyone else there paid taxes too, which is why there was a line system. The elderly woman was looking scared now, gripping her walker tighter. Karen noticed and turned back to her, threatening to knock the old woman down if she didn't keep her mouth shut. That was it. I stepped between them and told Karen she needed to back off immediately. She asked what I was going to do with one arm, calling me a freak. I told her to try me. Karen actually laughed like this was all some big joke. She took a step toward me, raising her hand like she was going to shove me. She threatened to put me on the ground if I didn't get out of her way. She reached out to push me, but I've been in physical therapy for 3 years. My balance is better than most people's, and my right arm is stronger than it's ever been. When she came at me, I grabbed her wrist, pivoted on my right foot, and used her own momentum to send her stumbling backward. She went down hard, landing on her backside in front of everyone. The entire line was watching now. Some people had their phones out recording. Karen screamed that I had assaulted her and that she was calling the police. I told her to go ahead, pointing out that there were about 20 witnesses who had seen her threaten to break my prosthetic and attack an elderly woman. Karen scrambled to her feet, her face red with embarrassment and rage. She threatened to sue me for everything I was worth. I asked her what evidence she had, considering that she had cut in line, threatened 2 disabled people, and then tried to assault me. By now, the security guard had come over. He'd been watching the whole thing from his desk near the entrance. He told Karen that he was going to have to ask her to leave. Karen yelled that this was discrimination and that she had rights. The security guard explained that she had the right to wait in line like everyone else or leave the building. Karen refused to leave until she got her business done, so the security guard called the police. When the officers arrived, Karen tried to tell them I had attacked her, but the security cameras told a different story. Plus, about 15 people in line gave statements about what really happened. The officer who took my statement was professional about it. He explained that Karen was being charged with disorderly conduct and attempted assault, and that I had acted in self-defense. Karen was handcuffed and led out of the building, screaming about lawyers and discrimination the whole way. The elderly woman patted my shoulder with a shaky hand and thanked me, saying what I did was very brave. I told her that nobody should have to deal with that kind of treatment. When I finally got to the counter, the clerk had watched the whole thing happen. She commented that it was really something and that she'd never seen anyone handle a situation like that before. I told her I just did what anyone should do, but she said that not everyone would have stepped up like that. I got my license renewed without any issues. On my way out, I saw Karen sitting in the back of the police car, still arguing with the officers. She caught my eye through the window and started mouthing threats at me. A few weeks later, I got a letter from her lawyer demanding I pay for her medical expenses from falling down. I forwarded it to my lawyer, along with the police report and the security footage the Department of Motor Vehicles had given me. My lawyer called me the next day and told me their case had no merit. In fact, given the threats and the discrimination based on my disability, we might have grounds for a countersuit. I told him I just wanted this to go away, but he explained that people like Karen needed to learn there were results for their actions. Karen ended up paying a fine and doing community service. Her lawyer dropped the case against me once he saw the evidence. I heard through the grapevine that she got banned from that Department of Motor Vehicles location. The elderly woman sent me a thank you card a few days later. She'd gotten my name from the police report. It had a picture of a cat on it and said, "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes." 10 years ago, I was stationed at an air base in a small town out west. I had just finished my deployment and was living in a decent neighborhood while finishing up my service commitment. I was working as an EMT on the side, which meant I kept a full trauma kit at home and had gotten pretty good at patching people up. Being military, I also legally carried a pistol, something that was completely normal and legal in that area. The house next to mine was where this whole mess started. From day one, I could hear yelling and screaming coming from that place. These weren't just regular arguments either. We're talking about full-blown screaming matches that would go on for hours, sometimes late into the night. The walls weren't thin. These were standalone houses with decent space between them. So for me to hear it clearly, it had to be loud. The first few times I heard it, I minded my own business. But when the screaming started, including things being thrown and what sounded like someone getting hurt, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the police multiple times reporting what sounded like domestic violence. They'd show up, talk to both parties, and leave. Nothing ever seemed to come of it. After about 3 months of this pattern, I finally got to meet the wife. She was taking out trash one morning when I was heading to work, and I could see she had fresh bruises on her arm. When she saw me looking, she quickly tried to cover them up. I asked if she was okay and mentioned that I'd been hearing a lot of noise from her place. She brushed it off, saying it was nothing and that they just argued sometimes. I pointed out that her bruises didn't look like nothing, and that the cut on her leg looked pretty bad too. She looked down and realized her shorts had ridden up, showing a nasty gash on her thigh that was still healing. She claimed she had fallen through their glass coffee table and called herself clumsy. I knew that wasn't the truth. I'd seen enough trauma cases to know what defensive wounds and abuse injuries looked like. I told her I was an EMT and offered to help clean up any cuts if she ever needed it. No questions asked. She seemed surprised by the offer but nodded quietly. Over the next few weeks, she started coming over more often, usually late at night when the yelling got really bad. I'd patch her up with supplies from my trauma kit, split lips, bruised ribs, cuts from being shoved into furniture. Each time I'd ask if she wanted me to call the police or take her to the hospital, but she always refused. She explained that her husband was a mortician in town who had a lot of friends on the police force. She was convinced they'd take his word over hers. She also mentioned that she didn't have family in the area and he controlled all their money, so she had nowhere to go. This went on for months. I'd hear the fighting, she'd show up at my door bloodied and scared. I'd patch her up and she'd go back the next morning. It was frustrating as hell, but I couldn't force her to leave. The neighbor, let's call him what he was, a complete piece of garbage, started getting annoyed that his wife was spending time at my place. He'd glare at me when I was outside, make comments about people who didn't mind their own business. I mostly ignored him, but I could tell he was building up to something. One afternoon, I was working in my garage when a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door. He looked serious, and I figured maybe someone had called about the noise again. The deputy asked if I was the resident of this address. When I confirmed I was, he told me he had a restraining order. I was being accused of threatening my neighbor with a firearm. My stomach dropped. I took the papers and read through them. According to the complaint, I had supposedly pointed my gun at him and threatened to kill him if he didn't keep his wife in line. The date listed was from about a month ago. I told the officer this was completely false and that I'd never threatened anyone with my weapon. He explained that the restraining order required me to stay at least 500 feet away from the complainant and his property. Given how close our homes were, I'd need to find alternative housing. This was bad. Really bad. Not only was it a lie, but a restraining order like this could mess up my military career and my EMT certification. But then I realized something. The date on the complaint was from last month, and I had sold my gun 5 weeks ago. I had sold it to a cop, actually. My girlfriend at the time was friends with a social worker who was dating this police officer. He had been looking for that exact model, and I needed some cash for my upcoming move back east after my discharge. I told the officer I understood he had to serve the order, but I needed to make a phone call because I had evidence that this complaint was false. I called up the cop who bought my gun and explained the situation. He was pretty shocked when I told him that my neighbor was claiming I threatened him with the gun he had bought from me last month. The cop told me to give him an hour because he was going to pay my neighbor a visit. What happened next was beautiful. The cop showed up at my neighbor's door with a photo of my old gun that he had taken for insurance purposes. He had placed a ruler next to it to show scale, making it look like official evidence. The cop knocked on the neighbor's door and showed him the photo. He asked if this was the gun I had threatened him with. My neighbor confirmed it was definitely that gun. When the cop asked if he was sure the incident happened on the date listed, my neighbor said he was absolutely certain and would never forget it. The cop then told him that was interesting because the gun had been in his possession for 5 weeks now. He had bought it from me well before the alleged incident. The neighbor's face went white. He tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The cop told him that he was being cited for filing a false police report and that the restraining order would be dismissed. I watched from my window as the cop handed him the ticket. The neighbor looked over at my house and I could see the rage in his eyes. He had tried to get me kicked out of my home and potentially ruin my career, and it had backfired spectacularly. A few days later, I was outside washing my car when he walked over to the property line. He asked if I thought I was pretty smart. I replied that I thought I was pretty honest, which was more than I could say for him. He told me I better watch myself because he knew people in town who could make my life very difficult. When I asked if that was a threat, he said it was a promise. At this point, I was already preparing to move. My discharge from the Air Force was coming up in 2 weeks, and I was heading back to the East Coast, but I wasn't going to let him get away with what he had done, not just to me, but to his wife. The week before I moved, I had a conversation with his wife during one of her late-night visits. I told her I was leaving town next week and asked if she knew that. She said she did but didn't know what she was going to do. I told her she was going to come with me. Not with me exactly, but I was taking her to a women's shelter in the city. I explained they had resources, legal help, and a safe place for her to stay. She protested that she couldn't because he would find her. I assured her he wouldn't, and even if he tried, she'd have people protecting her who actually cared about doing their jobs. It took some convincing, but she finally agreed. The day before I left, I loaded up her few personal belongings while he was at work and drove her to a women's shelter about an hour away. She was terrified but determined. For the first time in months, I saw hope in her eyes, but I still had one last thing to take care of. That evening, I went to the garden center and bought a small bamboo shoot. If you don't know about bamboo, here's what you need to understand. It's basically a weed that grows incredibly fast and spreads through underground root systems. Once it takes hold, it's nearly impossible to get rid of. People spend thousands of dollars trying to remove bamboo from their yards. I took that bamboo shoot home and cut it into about 24-inch pieces. Then I grabbed a rubber mallet and headed to his backyard under cover of darkness. I spent about an hour randomly driving those pieces of bamboo all over his lawn, near the house, by the fence, in the middle of the yard, everywhere. Within a few months, that bamboo would start sprouting all over his property. Within a year, it would be a massive problem. Within 5 years, it would probably damage his foundation and make the house nearly unsellable. The next morning, I loaded up my car and headed east. When I drove past his house for the last time, I could see him in his driveway, probably wondering where his wife had gone. I rolled down my window and waved. 2 years later, I got a call from my old girlfriend. She had kept in touch with a social worker who had updates on the situation. Apparently, the neighbor's wife had successfully divorced him and moved to another state. The women's shelter had helped her get legal aid, and she had been able to prove the abuse in court. And the bamboo, according to my girlfriend, it had completely taken over his backyard. He had spent thousands trying to remove it, but it kept coming back. The city had actually cited him for letting it grow into the neighbor's yard on the other side. I'm 31 and work in tech support for a mid-sized company. The pay forced me to end up in a shared flat situation. About 8 months ago, I found this place through a roommate finder app. It's a 3-bedroom apartment in a decent part of town, and splitting it 3 ways made it actually affordable. The other 2 guys seemed normal enough when we first met. One works at a bank and keeps to himself mostly. The other one turned out to be a real piece of work. He's in his late 20s, works some freelance job that apparently pays well enough for him to afford fancy clothes and expensive gadgets, but somehow he can't manage to buy his own groceries. When we first moved in, we all sat down and had what I thought was a clear conversation about house rules. We agreed that we'd each buy our own food and clearly label anything we wanted to keep separate. Common stuff like salt, pepper, cleaning supplies would be shared, and we'd take turns buying those. But personal groceries were supposed to be off limits unless you asked first. For the first couple months, everything was fine. Then it started small. I'd go to make my morning coffee and notice the milk was running low when I'd just bought a full carton 2 days before. Or I'd reach for eggs to make breakfast and find only one left when I'd bought a dozen. The first few times it happened, I convinced myself I was just using more than I thought. But then I started paying closer attention. I'd come home from work and see him cooking something that clearly required ingredients I'd just bought. When I'd ask about it, he'd get this sheepish look and apologize, saying he was making dinner and realized he was out of milk. He'd promised to replace it tomorrow and swear it wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again and again. The promises to replace things rarely turned into actual replacement. Maybe 1 time out of 5 he'd actually buy me a new carton of milk or a dozen eggs. The rest of the time he'd just conveniently forget. It got worse over time, and he started using my coffee, which isn't cheap stuff. I buy these specialty beans because I'm pretty particular about my morning coffee. 1 bag lasts me about 2 weeks and costs around $20. I'd come down in the morning and find him drinking coffee from my clearly labeled bag. He'd greet me cheerfully and say he hoped I didn't mind, explaining that he ran out of coffee yesterday. When I point out that it was my coffee with my name on it, he'd acknowledge it and promise to pick some up later to replace it. But he never did. He'd buy the cheapest instant coffee from the dollar store and act like that was an equivalent replacement. After about 2 months of this, I started getting really frustrated. I work early shifts, so I meal prep on Sundays. I'd spend time planning out my meals for the week, make a grocery list, and buy exactly what I needed. Then I'd come home Monday or Tuesday to find half my ingredients missing. The breaking point came when I was planning to make a nice dinner for a date I was bringing over. I'd bought everything I needed for this pasta dish, including some expensive Parmesan cheese and fresh herbs. The day of the date, I came home to find him in the kitchen. He casually mentioned that he hoped I didn't mind, but he'd use some of my Parmesan and basil for lunch today. When I asked if he was serious and explained that was for a dinner I was making tonight, he said he didn't know. I told him the stores were closed by the time I got off work, and my date was coming over in 2 hours. He just shrugged and said he'd definitely replace it tomorrow. That's when I realized this wasn't accidental anymore. He was just taking my stuff because he knew I wouldn't make a huge scene about it. So I decided to change my approach. I went out and bought a mini fridge for my room. Not a big one, just enough to store my milk, eggs, cheese, and other perishables. I also got a small storage container for my dry goods, like coffee and pasta. Everything that was mine went into my room. The change was immediate. Within 2 days, he noticed and asked where all my food was, saying the fridge looked empty. I told him I moved my stuff to my room. He wanted to know why I would do that, and I explained I was tired of my groceries disappearing. He said that was pretty petty and suggested we should share things since we were roommates. I reminded him that we'd agreed when we moved in that we'd buy our own groceries, and pointed out that he'd been taking my stuff for months. He insisted he always said he'd replace it, but I countered that he rarely did, and when he did, it wasn't the same quality. This went on for a few days. He kept making comments about how I was killing the vibe and being too territorial. He'd make passive-aggressive remarks about how some people were too uptight about sharing, but I stuck to my guns. Then things got interesting. Within a week of me moving my food, he started running out of basic necessities. He'd used my milk so often that he'd never bothered to buy his own. Same with eggs, coffee, and other staples. He'd ask if I had any milk he could borrow, just a little bit for cereal. I'd tell him no, I only bought what I needed for myself, and suggest he try the convenience store 2 blocks away. He'd act shocked that I really wasn't going to help him out, and I'd remind him that he could help himself out by buying his own groceries. This continued for about 2 weeks. He'd asked to borrow things, getting increasingly frustrated when I said no. He started complaining to our other roommate about how I was being difficult, but our other roommate had been watching all this happen. One evening, while the entitled roommate was out, he came to talk to me. He told me he thought I was handling this right and that he'd been keeping track. The guy had been taking his stuff too, just not as much as mine. He said the roommate never replaced anything and asked if I'd noticed. I told him I'd been dealing with it for months, and he decided he was going to start keeping his stuff in his room too. And he did. Now our entitled roommate was completely cut off from his free grocery supply. He had to actually plan meals and buy ingredients like a normal adult. But the real satisfaction came about a month later. He'd been complaining about money being tight, saying he couldn't afford to keep buying groceries. One evening I overheard him on the phone with someone, probably a friend. He was telling them he didn't know why we were being so weird about food, that it was just groceries and we were all adults. Then there was a pause, and his tone changed. He seemed confused about what they meant when they said he should just buy his own. He got defensive, saying he did buy his own, though sometimes he used theirs, but he always replaced it. Well, not always exactly, but still. After another pause, he asked if they really thought he was the problem. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but from his responses, it sounded like his friend was telling him he was in the wrong. His voice got quieter and more defensive. The next morning, I found a carton of milk in the fridge with a note apologizing for taking my stuff and saying this was to replace what he'd used. I never said anything about it, but he never took my food again. He started buying his own groceries and even began replacing things he'd taken from our other roommate without being asked. The funny thing is, once he stopped mooching off us, he actually became a better roommate overall. He started doing his fair share of cleaning and was generally more respectful of shared spaces. I still keep my food in my room though. Some habits are hard to break, and I like knowing that my morning coffee will be there when I need it. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.